Hey, welcome to the big show. Joining us today is co-founder of Cypress Hills Partners, none other than Kelly Claddock. Today, Kelly, the topic is moral hazard. So just to kind of set it up, my earliest recollection of moral hazard and the consequences around that was in the late 90s, I think it was, there was a hedge fund, long-term capital management, levered to the hilt, bunch of Nobel Prize winning economists were running the show. Banks bought into it, lent them a whole bunch of money, hedged against the ruble or something like that. It blows up. They have to get bailed out, and there was outrage, but that wasn't really in the consciousness of the public. And then fast forward to 2008. The global financial crisis, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers are allowed to fail, but a host of others are bailed out to the tune of $250 billion. Now we find ourselves in 2021, 22, they shut down the economy, and we've found out who else is too big to fail. I know you've done a little bit of work on this. Talk to us a little bit about the consumer and what happened with them in this last crisis.
Well, thank you for having me on, Dean, on this.
Hey, man, it's your studio.
This Dean Linden gondola.
Got to think of a better name for that, but I think I'm going to work on that.
Foster View at gondola. So I would say that what's going on, or what went on in 2020 to 2022. Certainly there was a lot of similar things in that, we had the economy crunch for a very short period of time, and that certainly put everybody on alert. As a debt manager, as a private credit manager, our first instinct was, okay, this is going to get really bad. Unemployment's going to go through the roof. How is this going to impact?
When you say it goes through the roof, what does that look like? What is that like? What was the highest it got to?
Yeah, I think we were hovering in the 5 to 6% range at the time, and our projections were it was going to get as high as 12 to 15%. That's what we were preparing for. It certainly didn't get to those numbers. It probably slipped up closer to 10%. But it was daunting at the time, because the first thing you think is anybody who's lost their job, anybody who can't go into work, is going to have a difficult time to pay their bills.
Right.
And that in itself is, when you have a debt exposure to that sector, that vertical, you need to protect yourself. You need to ensure you've been able to stress test it to a point where you will be able to find your way through it. So, at that point, as a debt fund, we felt we were well positioned. We felt that any sort of essential, non-essential services rise in unemployment would not have really a detrimental impact on our performance. And but to our surprise, it actually swung the other way extremely quickly, where instead of having this a scene where people weren't able to meet their minimum spending habits, it went the other way. We saw that in Amazon. Everybody was suddenly ordering, using a lot of disposable income that suddenly wasn't there prior.
Right.
Onto.
Right. They lost their jobs, yet they had more disposable income than they've ever had before. Was that because they didn't leave their houses?
I would say that you got to an environment where either they were without a job and they were relying on the government stimulus that was suddenly pushed out. So it's interesting, if you look back at the numbers, like the revenues of the budget for Canada is around a little over $300 billion in revenues. And normally we're running our expense total around the same number. In 2021, that number rose to $600 billion. So we basically doubled the entire expenditures of the country to achieve what they achieved, was to protect this consumer. And that consumer can be viewed and you can break it down into a prime consumer and near prime, subprime. Everybody was affected by it.
Right.
But the area that is that as a fund that we focus on is the kind of the near prime to subprime consumer. Currently in Canada, there's about of all the individuals that have a credit rating, about 8.2 million people, which is approximately 30%, are in that category.
Subprime or
near prime to subprime.
Right. Okay.
And I think what became clear moving into the pandemic was when you have almost a third of your entire population that are people who vote, they can have a very dramatic impact on the outlook of a political system, and that's really what I think transpired. We saw government stimulus come in at unprecedented rates, 100% of the total budget, and that resulted in suddenly, and we saw it in our own portfolios, we saw prepayments happening. We saw early prepayments. We saw loan losses get down to historic lows. All these things that you would have never thought would have happened.
And it's kind of a funny story in that, the examples that I cited at the outset was, greedy hedge funds, right? Big banks, getting bailed out. And now we've kind of had this environment where the little guy en masse got bailed out. How does that sit with you? Like not from the manager of a debt fund, but just does it sit differently that it was the little guy for a change that got, albeit in aggregate, it wasn't one little guy. It was, as you said, 1/3 of the voting population of Canada got bailed out, and many more around the world. But I mean, how does that sit different? How should we feel about that?
I think it comes back to how we've always viewed a certain segment of the population in Canada, and that segment being the near prime, subprime category. If you go back to the original thesis of Cypress Hills, was that those types of that category of creditors, they're extremely resilient. Like they have. And we have,
and you're not just, that's just not an observation. That's a number.
That's based on the data points that we've looked back at over the last 20, 25 years. That they're compared to a specific prime customer, their loss rates do not go. They don't have the same velocity that you would see for the prime customer. And as an example, of prime customers during the 2008-2009 crisis, losses went up by about 300%. Where in Canada we saw the near prime subprime customer go up by about 35%. So that alone in itself, you can see that the very resilient, and I think that's really what has transpired. That continues to evolve in our current economic conditions, is that if you want to have an economy that's based on services, and you want to have an economy has a significant amount of minimum wage workers, you need to for that economy to continue moving forward, those jobs need to stay full employment, right?
Right.
And as soon as that starts to untangle, then government's going to step in quickly to fix that and repair that. So I think it's become pretty clear that the government now views that certainly that segment of the population is that they're highly dependent upon. They're too big to fail, and that will only continue because, as you know, that segment of the population, very few of them own homes. Mm-hmm. So even with the interest rate hikes that are currently on the rise in globally, you won't see as quick a deterioration, from that perspective. Like it'll eventually get passed through rent increases, but even with rent increases, we have a social system or a legal system set up to protect those who are renting. So you have rent controls in a lot of the major centers throughout Canada.
Whereas interestingly, there are no similar restrictions on people in place who have to maintain a house. So the guy that's cleaning your pool or re-roofing your house or all of the upkeep things that you need to do, there's nothing limiting him. But that renter is, you're saying, inherently protected to a certain degree.
It's almost like an inflation hedge that
Right.
the person in that category has, and protects, and in effect protects the fabric of our economic system. But I believe you're right. Like mortgage rates go up. Next time you're in to renew your mortgage, there's nothing protecting you. They're not finding some sort of subsidy that they can provide to you, or have some sort of mortgage interest controls in place, right? Who knows? Like if rates got high enough, you at some point you're going to have another segment of the population, the other 67%, that will now be demanding similar.
Right. They vote too.
Yeah, they vote too, and so they'll have similar requirements and asks. But yeah, no, I think so. I think that's really the key.
And that's 66% of the population, ironically, is less resilient than you'd think. They're more vulnerable than that subprime, near prime group by the numbers.
For sure. And what we've seen recently, a recent poll that was put out by TransUnion data, is that about 25% of the population are in a position where they're unsure whether they're going to be able to make the full payment on their next loan or pay their bills off in full. But the interesting part of that stat is year over year, that number hasn't changed. And in fact, quarter over quarter, the number has actually gone down. So you see kind of, I think, improving economic conditions that have actually made, that provided that stimulus package move those individuals now into a position where they actually are working and are fully employed, and now their economic conditions are improving. So it'll be interesting to follow that along to see how that affects. But ultimately, if you have if your margin for error is less, enhancement of inflation.
When you say margin for error, whose margin for error?
For the near prime, subprime consumer.
Yeah, right. Gotcha.
Their margin for error will be less. Like you lose your job. That can be a problem, right? The safety net may not be enough to protect you.
Or what about if you keep your job and all of a sudden you've got this lift in everything you spend money on. You have to go to drive to your job, and that's cost 25% more, and that's part of the margin for error as well.
Yeah, and it comes back down to I think ultimately we're still in a deflationary environment. Like if you look at like a much larger long-term horizon.
Back the camera out a bit.
Yeah, so that's
and why do you say that, Kelly? What are the inputs that would make that statement true
I think the biggest input is just how technology has made us more efficient.
Yeah,
it's brought the cost of anything we do down to a fraction of what it was.
And you know what? What's interesting about that is we're sitting here in a podcast studio, able to broadcast to whoever wants to see this, and we're able to own it, control it. I mean, there's two of us sitting here. It's amazing.
The technology to put this together 15, 20 years ago would have been extremely high, right?
Yeah.
And now you're in a point where a fraction of the cost you can deliver this type of information globally. Yeah. Someone on the other side of the world can be listening to this podcast and have an opinion on it that can affect every.
Well, even the I mean, some of the bigger things like cloud computing, for instance. I mean, that changed everything. Now, I mean, that kind of blew up all of the startups and all of these young companies that would have had to have spent all this money on infrastructure now just can basically get into business for free, in a lot of cases. And I wonder how it changed our business. Like, I mean, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but I don't know that it would have been the same.
I couldn't imagine having to start our business at a different time. Like in 2015, we were able to use, the Google applications to, be extremely collaborative, extremely efficient in everything that we were doing, for a fraction of the cost that we would have had to do if we were, back in the early 2000s having to, fire up a bunch of Microsoft software for every one of our employees.
And that speeds, and that is a ball that's rolling downhill, a snowball that's getting bigger and bigger, and it's just sort of swallowing up and disrupting everything. And I think it probably speaks to that. These bailouts are bigger and bigger. We have to spend more and more money to keep things inflating. Ironically, it's ironic that we talk so much about inflation, but to your point, it's actually fighting off deflation.
And I think you're going to have that boomerang effect, because just the fact that inflation has created a higher cost structure for not only individuals but businesses, it's going to force those businesses into programs to create more efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, we're not hiring another person. We're adding some more technology to create more efficiency in our business. That effectively has a deflationary impact.
Yeah.
So, we won't see it maybe in the next 6 months, but 12, 18, 24 months out, you'll have that opposite effect come in where, inflation and deflation will start to set in. No different than what we saw with a lot of cloud services during the pandemic. Amazon as an example. Prior to that, you went to a physical grocery store, or you went to some sort of physical store to buy your goods. Suddenly, everyone was in a position where they're like, I'm not getting off my couch. I'm going to order it right here, and it's going to be here maybe this afternoon or tomorrow morning. And that efficiency and the opportunities, like Zoom is another example, remote offices.
Yeah.
You could get into, the ability to run a business now where you have half the amount of, 1/3 to 1/2 of the amount of square footage you normally had to run that business, because
you think about how that changes towns. Like you imagine, or not town, like cities. Traditionally, I mean, for as long as you and I have been in the workforce, I mean, you got in your car, you drove downtown, you took the elevator up to the 10th floor, 15th floor, whatever, and you walked out into just a bustling beehive of people that all had dry cleaning, all had lunch that day, was going someplace for lunch, went to the gym or something like that down there. All those things, when you talk about, and I always think about it in terms of real estate, these people that are, because I think that a lot of our clients, we all have exposure to real estate. It just kind of comes with the territory. So you kind of think about that first. But when you think about, that this cataclysmic change that took place really rapidly, the domino effect of that and how those downtown cores look is very different. Like it's very, very different. There's people that have made wonderful livings over the years, shining shoes in the lobby of those buildings, because people are coming up and down all the time. Most of those people, or a lot of those people now, not only are they not in the buildings, they're not even wearing their shoes. They got them up on their coffee table all day, like tapping away on their computer. So it's a pretty remarkable, to your point about deflation. I mean, that's a big deal. And it sped it up, but it's probably where we're headed anyhow. It might have taken a few more years, but this is a bit of a shock, needless to say.
I think it has been an extremely disruptive event, and how it speeds it up is that you have that much more capital being allocated to those disruptive technologies, or
You're saying that $25,000 a month that you're saving on those 3 floors in the high rise downtown, you're now allocating to more technology that's further leaning out your business.
The pandemic sped up the amount of VC money that went into those technologies. We've seen some of that result, but like anything, technology life cycle doesn't happen overnight. We're gonna see the benefit of a lot of that spend in the coming years, and so we're just at the tip of the iceberg right now as far as how that's going to impact the whole cost cycle and the deflation that we'll see. And I think whether it's the pandemic or whether now it's the inflation that is going to again accelerate that need to create more efficiency within a business, we'll continue to see that.
So just for people that watch, like where does it all end? Like do we find ourselves in the future where I don't know, maybe this is a bit hyperbolic, but are we is this just a race to zero? And what does that look like? So if it's if it costs us very little to live because technology is just sort of running in the background, sort of providing everything that we need at a unimaginably low cost, what's that feel like
for an individual? I think it's going to be a time of constraints, right? At the same time, a time of looking at ways to improve their economic condition.
And how does one do that? Like, I mean, I use the analogy of the guy at the base of the bank of elevators in a high rise shining shoes, and he did it. Maybe his dad did it before him. Well, suddenly that's not a job. What becomes of that guy? Or does he even need to make a living because that we've got technology has driven all of the things that he used to have to pay for, because he's companies are realizing these cost savings, but also that individual's getting that too, because suddenly his technology is driving the price of what he likes to do or is enjoying down to zero as well.
Yeah, I think you're going to have an impact of disincentivizing just as a result of those jobs no longer being there, where someone exits the workforce, and that will be. And we're seeing that. We see that in Vancouver. We see that. We see that with the homeless, and that certainly is a partially result of what we've seen as far as technology taking jobs away, and if the government and if there's not enough retraining programs in place to try to navigate we'll continue to see that. That's going to accelerate. At the same time, government will have to respond in some way to do that. Now, then you start getting into that whole question around, minimum
universal basic income.
Yeah,
that's a hot button.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating because there's a lot of super bright people that have kind of a strong opinion both ways. My opinion on it, for what it's worth, and it's not worth much, but I think to a certain degree there's some of us that have had a certain degree of universal basic income, because I think, and I know how you were raised as well. We're two like Saskatchewan guys, or in my case Alberta, but I mean, all I had to do my whole life as a young man is I had to wake up. I had to play. I never had to give a second thought to where I was going to sleep or what I was going to eat. And I just had to wake up every day and figure out how I was going to prosper. And I think that there's two schools of thought, right? Like, I don't think I was spoiled. I was waking up every morning figuring out how I was going to, make my way in this world. That's a nice position to be in. And I think what happens is, as we sort of see this cosmic shift take place, makes you wonder, like, I think I'm a self-made guy with an asterisk, because I only had one job, and that was to be, make something out of my life and be financially successful. I had one thing to do. So, from that perspective, it's like I shouldn't really screw that up too much, right? With that universal basic income is there to kind of provide that infrastructure, kind of a, that's pretty exciting. And everybody has that same chance. That's to me pretty exciting. That view is not shared by everybody though. That is not, and I understand where they're coming from as well. Oh, you're going to have a bunch of guys that never get off that and they're going to sit there and play their super cheap video game for, months at a time. I see it both ways. I do feel like we never called it that. It was called just a loving family environment. But nonetheless, I had the benefit of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of threads off that. I would say that it's going to, that it's going to be a bumpy ride going through that. We've talked in the past about how a new financial system could potentially, have an impact on that. But
that's probably another hour that we could do on that new financial system. I know where you're going with that, and that is a fascinating topic.
Yeah, but I think in the current time that we're in, we're going to continue to see again the disruption of how that's going to unfold, and we get excited about it. Like we look at our mobile phone and see how we can have basically private healthcare to a certain extent because there's so many ways to remotely measure one's health condition to a point where a lot of those services most likely will get delivered by private companies, right?
Yeah.
And
private companies that are able to monitor your vital signs 24/7, 365. You just have to go in and say your date of birth and your name, and they'll be able to tell you almost everything without even going into. Yeah, that is a great example of deflationary. When you think about the insurance companies and the bureaucracy that goes into something like delivering healthcare, like the millions or hundreds of thousands of jobs certainly that go into not delivering healthcare, but just delivering the payment of healthcare.
Well,
you disintermediate that. That is massive.
If you're able to transfer some of that efficiency away from spending money on, say, public healthcare to provide an additional safety net to individuals, or provide additional training to individuals, retraining for individuals. There's a whole bunch of things I think where, collaboratively, private and public can work together in that transition that we're going to go through. And but I think we're in a position where we're seeing a supply chain led kind of inflationary cycle that is at some point will have a massive rebound effect.
You said something there. You said supply chain led inflationary thing. Are you? Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth. Correct me if I'm wrong. But are you sort of like? Is that a little indictment on the Fed strategy of continuing to raise interest rates, that they're kind of they're the dog chasing the wrong car?
Yeah, and I ask that question a lot to friends and colleagues about how interest rate hikes are really going after the actual cause of the problem. The symptoms that we're seeing are certainly not led by they certainly weren't led by, let's say, some sort of we are, valuations globally have went up, housing prices have went up, all these, global debt levels have went up. Cheap money has created high valuations, no question. But those weren't necessarily, creating the kind of inflation that was really at the real crux of it, which was being able to get access to goods in a timely fashion and at a price that you you felt was not being inflated, and that's really where things have kind of turned into a different direction. So
Yeah, can you imagine if they get? I mean, if this is, if raising interest rates pushes us into a into a recession, and they miss the mark because the supply chain, doesn't, you would have, I mean, you can see, I never really understood even what, I always thought stagflation was kind of just sort of this sci-fi type of economic theory that really didn't even make any sense. And we're actually in an environment now where if it's like, well, it's the supply chain and you're trying to sort of restrict the money flow, which is just creating another problem that you didn't even have before.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where if you're trying to prevent someone from crossing the street to get to try to find another good and that if they go across the street, there's going to be less of them, so they're going to have to pay more for it. Mm-hmm. So instead of you letting them go across the street, you basically go to them and say, we're going to tax you
for crossing that street.
So it's going to cost you more to go across the street. You're going to do less of that.
Right.
And so it's an indirect tax that they're trying to put on the system to effectively slow this inflation down. Whereas they could have went at a different way and provided, how do we incentivize this supply chain restriction? And I get a lot of it happened outside of, let's say, Canada. It happened in countries that were the biggest exporters of some of those goods, which were having their own issues. But as we can see, a lot of those issues have started to come down. But so, I
mean, is this a globalization thing? Because when you say they could have gone at it a different way, but now you've got this disintermediated where no one's really in charge. Whereas and that's when I hear and whether you're a righty or a lefty, when people go, well, it's Joe Biden's got this inflation problem. We have it in Canada too. That's not, I mean, I don't think that has anything to do with any political party. I don't think, whether you're a conservative or a liberal, I think it's just nobody's in charge. This is just happening. This is a force of nature that probably, and if you want to be critical, it's probably, this problem was caused because we thought it was best at a certain point in time. There was a shared thinking that we need to shut down our global economy for a period of time. Right. And, we'd never done it before, so we didn't really know what the unintended consequences was. I never heard anybody say when we're going to lock down every major city in the United States and China and everything, I never heard anybody go, yeah, but the inflation on the back end or the supply chain, I certainly didn't think about that.
Yeah, exactly. So that we'll continue to, we'll see those supply chains start to improve because of that tax that the banking system federal banking systems are putting on their locals, but at some point, because it's not really attacking the problem itself, and there could be other measures that a government in those export countries are doing to influence that or change policies to impact that. Again, I think the rebound effect of this is going to be quite dramatic. I think
when you say rebound, you're saying what?
I'm saying that, not only are we seeing, we'll see in the future a rebound effect related to inflation, or related to, price movements coming down because of the fact that you've got technology having a major behavioral change to the way companies do business. On top of that, you're going to have that
supply chain opening up. Yep.
And then, so both those combined you'll see, a very different environment where, policies will have to, really loosen up to try and bring.
It's interesting because when you try and figure out, democracies and governments in general, they can't keep up with that. They can't make policy fast enough to keep up with technology. And then when you add in this it's always been kind of static. Our whole lives, we never even thought about the supply chain. How much time did you spend thinking about, especially the last 15 years, everything was just in time. You never found a time where I couldn't get such and such. and yet and now we're having these whiplash effects. I'm not sure that governments can sit. Well, it's interesting. It's happening at a time when we're becoming more polarized politically, and we are not able to get anything done. And they can't make policy fast enough to keep up with all the things that are changing. And I think that's a bit of a worrisome thing, because we all have ideas about how things should be fixed, but collectively we need to find some common ground where we go, this is a challenge that we've got to come together on and make policy that works for everybody. And it's we've gotten ourselves in a place where political systems haven't evolved enough. Like we haven't evolved politically, and that is and in the meantime, we're seeing companies like Amazon and Microsoft and all these, and Facebook. They're kind of Twitter. They're making the policy. They're making the policy, and governments are just trying to react and sort of cobble something together in order to sort of like put out a fire as they kind of start. Right? It's pretty fascinating times.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think overall, from bringing it back to, from a private debt perspective, with exposure to the consumer, I think we're seeing obviously a lot of disruption because of inflation. We're seeing disruption because of the cycle that we're in, as far as likely moving into a recession. But on the flip side of it, I believe there's a lot of green pasture ahead as it relates to that segment of the population, with these deflationary pressures that are coming up behind it, and that will act. In addition to the fact that government has proven that, that segment of the population is too big to fail, I think a combination of a lot of these things will show again how resilient that segment is, and continue to demonstrate to ourselves that the strategy that we employ currently is right on the money
and sustainable.
Sustainable, yeah.
Awesome. Why don't we leave it there, Kelly? Thanks so much. That was thoughtful, insightful, and let's do it again soon. You heard it here. Ciao.